Here we are.
I think the camera's ready to zoom in on us, so that means we can officially call our work session to order. He was focusing in just as I was looking at the other end of the table. So we will officially begin our work session. Thank you, everyone. We only have 2 items on our agenda, and as you can imagine, we put the superintendent's proposed budget first, and we are ready to begin our discussion around this. And of course, as always, we have I can't say enough. We all can't say enough about the work of both David, Mark, and Terry. We appreciate you joining us at the other end of the table.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start out, this being your second work session to discuss the budget. Just sharing what we've done since your first work session. At that work session, there were several business cases that you asked us to revise the verbiage on and actually expand upon it. I just wanted to, we're not going to go through that in detail, but wanted to share with you that we heard you and we have done that. And simply are just those business cases. The first one had to do with employer benefit matching rate increases. Again, you asked us to provide additional distinction on what was locally paid and what was state paid. The next one was on the principal held harmless provision with regard to their salary and the fact that the current state schedule for the current year holds them harmless from going backwards, but that legislation only goes through this current year. At this point, does not extend past this year. So we added, again, just some verbiage. None of the figures changed. The next one under new and expanding programs, school support for social emotional learning. Again, we just expanded here the context. You asked us to put the actual request in context with the real overall need of the district.
You skipped AIG.
No, sir, I'm just going slightly.
Oh, okay, all right.
He knows all that.
He's going his way.
And then, thank you, Mr. Fletcher, AIG, we again added verbiage to put it into context of the overall district need. But in addition, and this is the only case, that we actually made some changes as to the content, if you will. I believe it was Ms. Hartenstein had some questions about the K-2 nurturing program and wanted to see additional data. Ms. Moore is going to be bringing that data back, but meanwhile, we did make some changes, and I'd like to turn it to Kathy to share that with y'all.
So just very quickly, knowing that this is a multi-year case, this is bigger than what we're asking for, there were 2 pieces of sort of information that came out of the last work session that helped us with the lens for how to make some changes. The first one was the extent to which we already had data around K-2 nurturing and whether or not that was the right path moving forward. So we shifted the language in the case to, number one, not put all the eggs in that basket and reduce what K-2 programming would look like based on what the data review tells us as we move further forward. The bulk of the changes to the dollars actually came from a second piece, which were other kind of questions and feedback around all of the many needs that we have in our schools based on the number of students we have identified and the limited funds that we have available. So we decided to start with a different kind of framework where what we're going to use the bulk of the additional funds for is to ensure a baseline at elementary and middle schools around the human resource that is available at each school, so that every elementary school will have a full-time AIG teacher, every middle school will have a full-time AIG teacher, and then those schools that have larger numbers of AIG identified kids will continue to earn additional AIG MOE on top of that. So that's not a level of service that we've had. We felt like it was important to begin with a baseline, and then as we begin getting additional funds, hopefully as we move forward, we can increase that for all schools. And then there's a small piece of the budget, the request that also goes towards some materials and supplies to address K-8, pre-K-8 math materials. That's an area where we always have a lot of need and need additional materials. And then some readers as well for differentiating for higher ability readers also. And then a small piece of that for training for all of those new additional teachers that we're going to have. So it's more focused on providing a baseline of resources.
Okay. Thank you.
So those are the only changes we have made, and again, with the exception of this one that Kathy just spoke with on AIG, it's just been verbiage to enhance and further explain. With that, that's what we've got to present. There is an item on your agenda tonight at your board meeting to approve the board's proposed budget. If you get there, and if you don't, we will regroup and discuss next steps. Ultimately, the board needs to get to the county by May 15th, its proposed budget. We need a couple days of staff between when you make your final changes in order to be able to get it such that we can deliver.
I had one quick question, turn this more as a follow-up to the AIG funding. I'm assuming that having a full-time AIG teacher K-8 at all elementary schools is going to help identify still going to help to serve some of the intent of the original budget case that
Yes.
we are going to actively be able to identify some underrepresented populations for AIG, because that's been one of the issues in the past, that some of our schools haven't had a full-time AIG.
That work will continue, and really almost the beauty, I think, of adding that resource and making it a baseline at every school is at those schools that have lower numbers of AIG identified students, you are putting in the human resource to have the bigger impact even there on K2 in order to support the needs of students prior to the identification process, as well as whichever 3-5 students are identified. And then, as I said, if you have more identified students, you'll receive beyond that one. So.
Any other questions on AIG?
I'm just really pleased with the rewrite or the additional changes to that, because not only are we looking to identify, we need to give opportunity to our youngest to start experiencing more complex thinking than they are getting in their classroom, and stretching their thinking without being identified, having them have the experience of participating in those kinds of activities. So putting it in people, good thing.
I don't know, well, I won't frame it as a question because I will wait until we see where this goes for next year. But I want to add kind of on both lines of both identification of students who are most often not identified, as we saw the great spread of the N&O last year. And I think doing some of this of stretching kids earlier can help with that. But my curiosity will be, and I mostly because I see you all coming into the room who are in our AIG department. I will remain curious next year about, are we also going to look at alternative ways to exercise that for kids who are marginalized, who we do need to be using different structures and methodologies to actually identify and stretch those kids in different ways, because we already know, and I think the article did a great job, especially the panels that were held, that just because kids may be coming to us with some deficits doesn't mean that they aren't already gifted in ways that we don't generally recognize as a school system. And I mean all school systems, not just ours. So.
But then that means, too, as we identify more, we've got to be more cognizant of getting more funding.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. So we address it. It's even more harmful to start identifying and then just letting them.
I don't disagree, but I would say for kids of color, they haven't been identified, and just the identification could actually change the trajectory of for them in our schools.
And there's some new, I was just talking to a school psychologist, formal one, that there's some new testing instruments that are proving to be incredibly
That's what I've heard.
effective. So I am much more reliable in helping us. So I hope we'll be looking at that.
There's a part of the presentation for student achievement in May that digs into our pathways and the results of what's happening with the assessment that's part of K2 nurturing versus what happens with the assessment that they take in third grade. That'll inform, I think, some of this discussion.
But I think Roxy's point that we don't want to lose is that as we identify more, which we need to do,
Right, I agree with
we can't take this fixed pool, which is capped right now at 4%, and spread it thinner. So I think it's imperative that I tried to really push this 2 weeks ago, but it's imperative that we establish a cleaner, sharper, more articulate legislative agenda. And I think we should start this year asking to double that to a cap of 8%. That's still less than half of our 17% identified. But that's a doable goal. It's a doable stretch goal that lift the cap to 8%. And if we do that, that helps everybody in the state. That doesn't just help Wake County.
Right. And it helps all children because we're identifying more. So it's not just a one subject for one group of people.
Right.
This is for everybody in our schools.
I
Can
agree,
anybody
but
tell
my
us
job
when-
to have both and we
Yeah.
tend to not
Yes.
talk about the other.
When
Well, I know
was
that's what I mean, but I don't want just the AIG we have identified now to think it's just for them. It's for the ones we're going to further identify.
Because I'd like to know the dollar value for the spec ed as well. Spec ed, we heard the dollar value hadn't changed since the 90s, early 90s. Does anybody know when this $13.22 was set?
AIG?
AIG?
It has not changed since at least 1995 when the person who is currently at DPI began working with AIG.
Yeah. Okay.
And you'll
So
see
costs have
slight-
changed just a little bit since
So you'll see
95.
some variances every year that are about benefits or inflation, but the actual per pupil amount has not had a raise since at least 1995.
So that's about the same time frame. I think they said 92 was for spec ed.
Right.
What's the dollar value for spec ed? Do we know?
Thought it was 1,000.
I believe it's higher than that.
What was the question?
Karen, how much do we get per student from the state?
The combined federal and state is around 9,000.
I can't hear.
9,000.
9,000 per student?
9 to 10, yes.
And state's around 4.
That's federal and state.
That's a combination of federal and state?
But that supplement above state teacher salary schedule? I think the number we're looking for is what's the difference above a standard teacher?
For a standard student?
Student. I thought you were talking about student.
Student.
So there's for per pupil expenditure, there's regular ADM.
Right.
So we get ADM for every student.
Right.
In addition, for special education students, I don't have the breakout
Yeah,
in my head.
that's the number we're looking
But
for.
the combined state and federal is between 9 and 10,000.
So that's the combined for that
Including
one
the ADM
student.
allocation.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That including or on top of ADM?
On top of ADM.
On top of ADM, yeah.
The dollar value for school-aged is $4,253.55 per funded child count from the state.
Again?
$4,253.55. So $4,253 per funded child count with the 12.75% limit. That did change from last year. It was 12.5%, moved to 12.75%.
Yeah, and that amount, though, has only gone up that 0.25 since like 1993. So, I mean,
And the cap amount went up, but the dollar amount did not.
Dollar amount fluctuates minimally every year to pay for raises and employer benefit changes, but it's not a significant formula change.
Good job, Jonathan. You almost called it.
And just for clarification, right, that $4,253 is all you get if that child needs a one-to-one TA.
That is correct.
And that one-to-one TA is going to be paid more than $4,000. Therefore, who makes up the difference? Just general scenario.
We find other funding sources for it.
Finding other funding sources means what? I mean, we have to be clear in what's happening, right?
Well, we had that grant that ran for quite some time, and now that money is gone. So that other funding sources is we're going to be asking our...
It's called local property tax.
So where I'm trying to get us to go is to recognize that when we underfund these mandatory needs, that means we have to take things away from other educational sources.
Unless it...
Because there ain't no treasure chest where we can go find those extra funds.
Other questions? Comments? So to Mr. Sorry.
What page can I find the unfunded, the, what do we call it?
Legislative.
Or legislative, what?
Which ones?
Unfunded mandate.
Deferred needs or unfunded mandates?
We did not include the deferred needs in this document.
Oh, you don't have that, okay.
We did not include that in this document.
Yes, that wasn't as...
We were told it was a poor planning tool.
Okay.
Or in other words, they don't want to know that.
Right.
So we can
In
ask
order to
for...
provide the current
Not a
level
good
of
plan to
inadequate
transfer us.
service we've been providing.
So I've been struggling with the budget and how I would necessarily vote. And I have to preface everything with, I think staff, superintendent have done a yeoman's job to try to both articulate, scrub the budget. We've got money that there are programs that we're discontinuing. We've repurposed a lot. I'm still personally cautious that the ask of 58.9 is going to be met with, thank you very much, here's 30. And I don't want us to get caught in that scenario. I know I've talked to a variety of you about various ideas. I think there'd be some strategic wisdom in us looking at what we can do now as opposed to just waiting. And I do not discount any of these asks. Some conversation with temporary superintendent Burns to potentially consider setting aside some of these asks, as commissioners have said, come back when you have needs that aren't met. So things like, for example, the $3 million that we have to take care of the K-3 class size issue. We don't know what that's going to be until after census date. So it strikes me that's $3 million that we could set aside. Not saying it's not needed, but come back for the ask when we actually have the clearer idea of what that ask is, while at the same time going to the state legislature and saying, look, let's come to a compromise where it's no cost to you and no cost to us if, as long as we've met the legislation up until census date, things that happen post-census date, I mean, either the legislature gives us some more money to open new classes, which I don't think that's going to happen, or we basically say, okay, you were good up to census date. You can breathe until next year when the next census date will be. So it strikes me that that's, again, a legislative point that we can go to and say, hey, here's a win-win for you, legislature. And if we win on that, there's $3 million that we don't need. And so I wonder about, can we create a scenario where we take a few of these items and say, look, we're not going to put them in the direct ask that we're asking right now. We're not saying we're going to cut them, but we set it aside for an ask when some of these other things that conceivably could happen don't come through. I just think that there could be some political wisdom to that. I don't know where anybody else lands on that. I would ideally love to see us take it down to, a 49 instead of 58.9 additional ask, I think that would strategically put us in a stronger position. I don't like doing any of it, but it's just...
Well, the early number from the county was 22 million.
Right.
So the county's going to set a tax rate in June for the coming fiscal year. They're not going to adjust it in August or September or October. So whatever the budget is May 15, they're going to wind up setting their tax rate and their ordinance by the end of June. And I have concerns about setting aside or postponing an ask when we've got prudent financial folks who have put this budget together. It is a large ask, and perhaps we haven't done enough to communicate with the public why this is necessary. This is the result of many years of the school district, from whatever funding source we're going to talk about, being underfunded for the level of service that our community demands. And that, to me, we've had great cooperation with county commissioners for 2 years. Last year, that kind of we were concerned about what happened last year. This year, I don't know what will happen. I'm hesitant to reduce the value of what we say is needed to provide the services that our community deserves. And so I just put that as a contrarian point of view. Political wisdom might be to only come forward and ask for $22 million. That doesn't meet the needs that I was elected to do.
No, I agree with that.
So,
I'm just looking at the one pager and looking at, the big numbers. We have growth, continuing programs, inflation, legislated increase, which we know could vary. Hopefully it will be lower. We're not sure. And then the new and expanding programs, $5 million of which is the counselors and social workers that we know are needed. Even if the state does improve their formula, we need to serve the people in our county. And so I hear you, but these are needs for our kids in our schools. And we have to show what those needs are. Now, if the state legislature comes back and says, hey, we're going to fund, then that's a conversation for sure. I think it's both and. We recognize that we have these shortfalls, a lot of which are because of state funding shortfalls, and we are asking our elected officials at the county to help us with that. And so I think it's a yes and. I don't think it's a set aside.
Yeah, and I'm not at all trying to say that these aren't real needs. I think they absolutely are. I just, what I fear is that if we ask for 58.9, we'll be lucky to get 39. My gut tells me that if we come back with the 49, we have a much higher chance of getting 49. That's Jim's perspective.
Well, yeah, I think I've been going back and forth on this, and I think at first I was thinking too that I do think the $3 million that the legislature is going to make us play this game somewhere, it's not a game, but this piece in the middle of the year, I don't think we should fund that. I think we should do what we have to do, ask the county commissioners, ask the legislature, or not put a child in that school, because that's the impact it is. We can't keep throwing money at that. So I think that $3 million for the middle of the year possibilities that are going to happen, we should not ask for. I think we should deal with it when it comes. And if it comes, it probably will.
So what if we're not going to put the child in the school, where do we put the child?
Put the child where we have a spot.
And how do we get the child to that location?
We have to work. I don't know how we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
I'm saying
it's still an expense to do the transportation.
Yes, it is an expense. Yes, it is an expense. But still, throwing that $1 million, saying we're going to put a new classroom because we have one extra child is also, I'm not sure the right way to look at it either. I would rather try to waiver or get the money from the commissioner's grant. So that's a part I would like to maybe take out. And then I went back and forth on whether we could ask for some less, and even though the needs are really there, and they might be willing to come up some, but now I'm beginning to believe they have a number in mind, and that maybe that we need to go for everything but that $3 million.
Ms. Hartson, did you go over your
Which, clarify for me, Ms. Cash, the $3 million for...
I think it's about $3 million if a class, that we're anticipating if a class goes over.
$2,906,893.
Class goes over the number they need.
Oh, yeah, and they're not going to allot us, okay.
This is page 120.
Yes, I know what she's talking
It's
about.
hiring teachers mid-year.
Yeah, I know what she's talking about. This proposed budget, I'm probably going to be the outlier. To serve the students and the family of Wake County Public Schools, $58.9 million is not enough. Okay? We have asked staff to bring us a budget that will help us continue to move a baby step forward, not a leap, a baby step forward in what we have here, particularly in new programs. I have a real concern about the special education in terms of if it is only going to increase with the number of families moving in with high needs kids. And it takes a lot to support that classroom. And if we keep at the rate we're going, we're also going to run out of the physical building space. Like, where are we going to house these children? And they deserve the same services that the AIG kid deserves. And I'm not willing to cut and say, we already fund our special ed at a higher, our formula is, I'm not sure if I want to say lower or higher. It's lower than what the state allocates. I had to think about that. I don't want to see that change and say, well, we're just going to fund now according to the state formula, not Wake County's formula. Because that is not helping children at all. I'm not willing to ask for one. I do not want to ask for anything other than $58.9 million. I think that's what we go in with because that's our responsibility. Our responsibility is to meet the needs, and this is just a basic meet the needs and help us make it baby step forward. It's our county commissioners that have to decide whether they're going to fund it. And they can fund it. Mm-hmm. They can fund it. Mm-hmm. Yes, it requires a tax increase. Yes, we have tons of constituents who go to the county commissioners and say, raise my taxes. No, I'm not so crazy about paying a couple $100s a year, but what I'm going to get for this whole district is worth that. And that's the responsibility of the commissioners. It's not ours. Ours is to bring them the needs. This is what we need. I don't want to. And if they only want to give us, as Mr. Fletcher says, what did you say, 22?
22 is what they said at our last joint meeting. We got 22 we haven't allocated yet.
And I think we emphasized at our joint meeting that we need to go together to the legislature.
Absolutely.
To work
Absolutely.
on that backfill because our county commissioners should not be meeting the basic needs. We should be working to expand programming.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, and we need to
do that.
To do that.
We need to do that.
Go together to Jones Street.
Yes.
Legislature needs to take care of it.
That's that's the one thing I've heard consensus on now for 2 meetings. So
Yes.
I do want to hear from other folks about where we are with this budget request.
And I would agree. I think it's an election year for the state legislature, and everyone loves teachers and public education in election years. So I think it's that we, to echo some points, I think we need to do our job as a school board, and that is to state the needs that we have. I do agree with Ms. Cash. The only thing I can see in this budget to set aside would be that $3 million. I would, as I've said, I would love to do a waiver. That seems win-win for the state and for us. So, but that it really was the only going through this budget. The other things are a marginal increase in maintaining what we're doing now. And I think we all have a vision that's bigger than that. But for now, I would support what we have going forward, save that $2.9 million mid-year class size allotment. But that's where I am at.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in where they are?
I'll come back. This year, Brockcliffe Elementary was the poster child for what's happening as a result of the K-3 class size reduction with the given staff that they had.
Who was?
Brockcliffe Elementary. They reduced class size, and when they reduced class size, their staff, they had to move people from 4th and 5th grade to K-3. The result was 36 4th graders in a classroom. They had to move the desks out. They had 5 desks in the room. They had other seating that they came up with, pillows and lounge chairs. I mean, they really were creative. They really were creative in what they did. Instruction was carried on. Mid-year, our central administration found another teacher. So there were 2 4th grades, 2 5th grades, and a combo, 4th, 5th combo, all of them oversized. That extra teacher allowed them to reorganize mid-year and come down into the 20s for all of those classes. Made a world of difference. Having those resources available is a critical support for what we don't know in our 113 elementary schools as we move forward. We will have schools that grow more than 3 kids per classroom as we move forward. It will happen. The least expensive, and it won't just be 1 kid that pushes us over. It'll be the fact that there are 3 extra children in 4 classrooms, and it's the 13th child that will push us over into having to set up another classroom. And that's assuming that there's some classroom in Wake County where that 3 students is balanced, the 3 over is balanced out by having 300. So I'm concerned about that, and I guess I would pose the question to my fellow board members this way: if we had taxing authority in Wake County, if North Carolina were like 1,400 other school districts in the nation, would we be willing to stand for election supporting this funding request? I think that's our question. The county commission has the same question. But I'm comfortable making my decision to support the superintendent's recommendation with that understanding that were we to have taxing authority, I would be willing to support this and advocate for this and run for office based on what this budget will do for our schools and our children.
And I'm completely with you, Mr. Fletcher, on that. I'm very glad to give a dime for education. Give a dime, that takes us halfway between where we are now and where Charlotte Meck is today. Not talking Jersey taxes. Talking halfway between where we are today and where Charlotte Meck is today. And that dime is based on the numbers that the commissioners provided to us. The dime differential is where we used to be in terms of the number of the fraction of the tax that went to Wake County Public Schools. So yes, I'm with you. I'm ready to give a dime for education. And by the way, this request is only half a dime. I'm ready to give a dime.
We lost one.
Yes, we did. We'll wait and see what he says. Yeah. Mr. A.G.? Sorry, I can't see you, the chair.
Oh, all right. I'm okay.
Okay. So, as Mr. Nieder has reminded us, this is on our agenda to vote on in open session. And of course, it'll still be open for discussion when we open up the vote there, but I do want to make sure that we aren't going to leave this topic with any major questions that staff might need to pull up. I don't want to put them in that position once we get in there.
Well, let me just get clarification.
Yes.
This budget assumes that the legislature is going to do what % increase in compensation for state-paid positions?
Yes. It assumes for school administrators 2%.
Okay, so 2%.
Certified staff, 2%.
Okay.
Non-certified staff, we assume.
Right. We're all dealing with assumptions now.
A $1,000 flat increase. And we've also built into the request for those individuals that $1,000 would not be 2%, the differential to bring them up to 2%.
Okay. So if the state decides, because there's a $500 million surplus of revenues over budgeted expenses, decided to do a 3% increase, we're way out of whack. We're woefully inadequate in terms of what our local support would be. If they do a 1% increase, what would be the impact on us? I mean, what would be an approximate impact of an additional 1% increase at the state level? And one year they did a 7% increase for some people. So
yeah, we can give you an estimate. Let us work on that for a minute.
Okay.
But those are the challenges we face each year.
Right.
Being able to at best estimate or guesstimate where the legislature will go.
All right, and it's. I don't know that I need the number now, but it's a. Again, we're at the mercy of the legislature.
If I had to pick a number for the non-certified, I'd say it's about $2-ish million per % increase.
Okay. I know given time, our crack staff can come up with an estimate.
I know, I was about to say, it looks like Terry's trying to figure it out.
What are you looking at when you're trying to see?
It's about 2 million.
I mean, so that would be a separate ask, right? That if they came up with something different, that would be an ask that we could go to them.
Do you have any sense of what the legislature might be doing? I don't either.
It's an election year, therefore I expect something.
6%? You've heard 6%?
5 and 6. It's 2.8. It's
I'm just going to roll my eyes on that.
If I could,
great.
for those of you that have your budget documents, take you to page
Election year.
15. If you look at a legislative impact, and again, this is a little back of the envelope math, so don't hold it to the dollar, but it gives you a good estimate. These are all based on 2%. So if you come down at the very bottom, you see salary increase, certified personnel. Under the local sources column, you see $1 million. It's over $1 million. That's for a 2%. So if it turned into a 6% increase, you could triple that number.
Right, okay.
You turn it to a 1%, you can cut that roughly in half.
Page 15.
That's just the salary component. Then you've got their supplement component. But the same methodology would follow there. You can divide it in half to get to what 1% is, and you can take that times whatever to give you the variability. And then on the following page, not quite as simple here because, again, it wasn't just it was $1,000. It wasn't 2%. get a little bit of sense of variability of what those numbers may be, but we could give you exact numbers there.
Okay. No.
But, to your
it's just going to impact us.
Yeah, and to your point, we've got to do, school board, we need to do our job with this budget.
Right.
Commissioners will have their role to do. We don't know what the state's going to do, so chances are we're going to have an interim budget again, given whenever the budget from the state comes out. So we need to stay focused on our role in stating our needs and being able, we can't anticipate what what the state's going to do, which is 59% of our budget. The local commissioners' budget are going to do that are 29-30% of our budget. But we have to look at the whole thing.
I do think it's interesting that the legislative committee is reviewing changing the funding model without looking at adequacy. And somehow we need, with the county commission, somehow we need to inform that committee of some a point of view that they may not have seen.
Because they've looked at other models that would have that
They're looking at models from states that don't have income taxes, rely totally on local property taxes, do all different kinds of Robin Hood strategies to take from to limit state funding in districts that have a strong tax base so they can provide the funding to districts that do not. And some states have even throttled efforts to go above that state formula to provide extra resources to local schools. And we certainly don't want to get in that situation in North Carolina.
No.
So a couple points just to help with communication clarification. I hear some people complaining that we don't have an acuity model for the counselor ask that we have, even for the $5 million. It is my understanding that we do have at least the groundwork for that kind of acuity model. But could, just for the record, something be said to help clarify what we mean by that, to communicate to those who say, oh, you're just asking for $5 million. I know we're not just asking for $5 million, but I think in this discussion it would be useful for that new ask to articulate a little bit more how we plan to deploy that $5 million. We can't sit here and say this is exactly the way it's going to be because we don't have to deploy yet. But
well, I mean, I can answer.
Yeah.
We do have an acuity model. We have played with identifying the schools that would rise to the surface with an acuity model, which has then raised questions about taking a look at the factors that we're using. So, we looked at a number of things like referrals out of the school to social services or outside services. We look at some of the trauma-informed pieces in our community-based resiliency model and the ACEs work. And we're also looking at, we've added recently, this is a revision, we've added recently what's happening with the elementary suspension data and the other data. So we've added those pieces to the model, which makes it shift. And so I think that we have an acuity model framework, but we're still playing with, and we're happy to bring the pieces to the board for further discussion so you can see what they are. It's just, and this is, the need is so much larger than what we're asking for, that fine-tuning what we're asking for and that amount is not an easy task. So, because it needs to then sort of expand as we grow more dollars into it and make sense as we get bigger also, not just now. So
it's fair to say even the $10 million we asked for last year had an acuity model.
Yes.
This is just looking at, all right, let's tighten up those limits. Even that $10 million was a third of what we think is where we need to go.
That's correct. And we can bring some more information to the board so you can see what those factors are that we're looking at.
Thank you. I just wanted to make it clear because sometimes people just look at this and say, well, there's $5 million. You don't know what you're going to do with it. We know we don't know precisely, but we have a pretty good idea of where we're going to go. The other piece that I think would be wise to get in the public discussion is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, we say that about $5.5 million is going to go to charters. But if I'm not mistaken, that $5.5 million is looking at the charter increase in population. Is that not correct?
Yes.
Which is like 13%, whereas the WCPS is projected to grow by about 1%?
Yes.
But on top of that, because the charters make up roughly 7% of the entire, if you will, student body of all of Wake County, not just the Wake County Public Schools, if, for example, we ask for $10 million for X, I don't know, like the $11 million for opening new schools, 7% of that will go to charters, effectively, because 7% of the entire budget goes to charters. So that means, in addition to that $5.5 million, $700,000, roughly, from opening our new schools, goes to charters.
That $5.5 million would include all things within our local county appropriation, which would include the growth associated and the funding associated with the opening of new schools.
Okay, so it may be included into that 5.5. I guess the point that I want to make sure that people understand is that if we ask for $5 million for counselors, 7% of that goes to charters, whether they provide counselors or not. When we ask for $9 million for spec ed, 7% of that goes to charters, whether or not spec ed services are provided.
Is that true?
When $11 million are provided for opening new schools, 7% of that goes to charters, whether new schools are opened or not.
That's
of local funding.
Of local funding.
Keep saying.
The way we've chosen to display that in the budget, though, is showing that number separately. So we are looking at what are the potential numbers of children in charters and Wake County school system, and the potential revenues, which is more than just county appropriation that we pay on a pro rata share to the charter schools. So on these funding requests, the amounts that are requested would go specifically for those items, and there would not be a portion of that to charters because we've shown that charter adjustment as a separate figure.
But roughly,
it would not dilute.
It doesn't dilute that, but but the money is there. Yes.
Imagine looking at it the other way. If we didn't have to spend the $5.5 million for charters, it could be distributed over all categories.
Right.
It is the same, but it's not. If you understand the way it's presented, it is pulled aside. But if you did not have to pay that, then you would have that amount of money to distribute across categories.
Or we would have less of an ask and do the exact same thing.
Yes.
And we can take it out and make it ask for it. That seems the right way.
Oh, how I wish thank you for the clarification. I mean, I think, again, to your Dr. Martin, it is important that people see how much of the budget will
transparent.
go to.
In a transparent manner.
Great. Mr. Sutton, I asked the question while you were out. I wanted to make sure there were no other questions or anything that we would want staff to look up for, so they won't have to do that out front. I want to get the questions that may require them to do a little bit more digging done in here, so that when we call for the vote out there. Okay. All right. Sounds like we will be ready one way or the other on this vote. Would you present it to us, Alfred?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have to reset.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, buddy.
Can you? I'm just going to give a brief overview to our next item if you're ready. Just as the background, we're bringing you a little bit of an update on Title I planning for 18-19. You will recall at the November Student Achievement Committee meeting, we provided an overall update on the changes that ESSA was bringing to the school, and a lot of the ESSA changes impact what we do in Title I. So, some of the language hopefully will ring a bell with you, and you'll understand it because we actually talked about some of it on November Student Achievement Committee meeting. And then actually at the March Student Achievement Committee meeting on an unrelated, sort of related item, we were talking to Restart Schools about calendar changes, and I think it was East Wake Middle that was here, that as they were making their changes was really concerned about the impact of some Title I changes moving forward based on what our planning was looking like for next year. So there were some questions that came up then that we thought we were going to look into. So that'll be a part of the information that's in the update that Brian and Melanie will bring in.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So as Kathy articulated, there's two big rocks that you have had an opportunity to hear from. Obviously, one was the principal at East Wake Middle School. The other one, in your day and a half long work session, we talked a little bit about focus schools and how that designation was changing during time. So Melanie Rose, our senior director for state and federal programs, is going to walk us through some of those legislative impacts, as well as the bridges that we're going to create to help provide stability for our schools. So Melanie?
Okay. So what I've provided you with is just some real overarching information about Title I next year. You'll see there that I've listed how many schools will receive Title I funding and broken it out by elementary and secondary. We will have more middle schools receiving it next year because of the third bullet. We have lowered the threshold for secondary school participation from 75% free reduced lunch percentages to 70%. That then allowed us to have 2 more middle schools receiving Title I funding next year. So we will have 3 traditional type middle schools receiving Title I funding, and our 4 alternative schools will also continue to receive Title I funding. You'll see that our per pupil allotments are remaining the same. The threshold for any school, any elementary school to enter into Title I funding is at 45%. Now we do hold tight to that one. They have to be 45% to meet it, or like 44.99. Yeah, they got to be right there. And that's still at $450 per child who qualifies for free or reduced meals. Then for the 50% to 65%, basically, it's $550 per child who qualifies. And then our highest per child allotment is $1,100, and that's for schools that are at 64.5% or greater free reduced lunch. It's important to note, because we operate school-wide Title I programs, the schools receive the money because the children have qualified for that help. But the services can affect and impact any child within that school. So those are they're pretty much the same as this year.
Melody, do you know how many elementary schools we have in each of those categories?
In each of the categories?
Yeah, like how many?
I can break it down for you. I don't know. 65% and higher is the largest.
Yeah, but do you?
But I can break it down for you, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
That's fine. Just send me an email. I just want to know how many.
Absolutely. Okay, anything else on that first part? Okay, and the second part goes to what Kathy was stating about the changes that are due to ESSA. Under No Child Left Behind, we had all of those sanctions, and then states were given the opportunity to apply for a waiver from the sanctions of No Child Left Behind. North Carolina took advantage of that. With that waiver came the categories of focus school, priority school, and reward school. So reward schools were closing the gaps, focus schools had gaps that were too wide, and priority schools were just the ones who were really struggling to get their kids to achieve. With ESSA, all of those designations go away. So while in Wake we do have focus schools, we've never had a priority school. We do have focus schools. They will remain in focus school status this year, but as of June 30th, that designation no longer exists. If you'll recall, under ESSA, there will be a targeted support and improvement identifier and then a comprehensive support and improvement identifier. Those don't come into place next year. There will be a watch list for them in the fall, but no school will be designated as such. So there's no allowable set aside of money from the Title I budget to help the schools who will fall into the criteria of TSI. We won't have a CSI school. Those are the lowest performing 5%. We will not have to worry about that. But we will have, I'm certain, some schools designated as TSI. Well, next year, there's no opportunity for us to set aside any money to help them as we were able to do with focus schools. With focus schools, we could set aside money that was above and beyond the school's Title I allotment. Do you have a question, Mr. Sutton?
No.
Okay. So because that was above and beyond, a school that was on the lower end of the per pupil allotment could still afford the instructional coach because it did not have to come out of their school's money. It came out of that money that we were allowed to set aside. With not having an opportunity to do that next year, we could have some schools who still have the need for an instructional coach and for instructional coach support, but can't afford the position. So what we've come up with is, and we've asked DPI and they've said yes, using carryover money to create a half-time literacy coach at every Title I funded school. That will help to offset the loss a little bit, and it will help to help all of our schools with instructional coaches, because currently all elementary schools get allotted a half-time literacy coach from other funding sources. So Title I funds will supplement that which is already allotted, and every school will then have a full-time literacy coach.
So over these 42 schools?
Over all 49 of them, because the middle schools will get a half-time literacy coach also.
Okay.
It's just they would have to use their other funds to create a full-time
They don't have the half in.
Right. They don't have the half to supplement.
The elementary schools do have the half, so they wind up with a full-time.
Yes.
Over those 42 schools. Okay.
So with the extra flexibility under ESSA, we're getting less funding.
Well, I think in the 1920 school year, they will do something to support the schools who are identified as TSI. It's just because there's no official designation yet, they are not allowing us to do any kind of set aside to provide funds. Even if they would turn up on the watch list, there's nothing official that's out there that says you could put some money aside to help these schools get their student subgroups out of the F range.
But my concern is that, we're going to be using carryover, which is a tried and true strategy. However, a year from now, are we going to be looking at a local ask to continue these needed coaches in these schools?
Right. And so what DPI is doing is they're saying, yes, this is okay for carryover for this year. What we would have to do in subsequent years is know we have enough carryover to be able to support it, which isn't really the purpose of the funding. The purpose of the funding is to spend it on the kids who are in the schools during this year. It's just for next year, we'll be able to support it. We cannot project out what we might be able to do for 1920.
To maintain current.
Right. So we'll message, and we have messaged it to the schools that this is a this year allotment. We haven't made any commitment to a long-term allotment.
Is there a job description and/or criteria for a literacy coach in a school? And is it, if you're a Title I school, is that job description any different?
No. It's the same job description. They have very, of course, with Title I, we have to be careful that our Title I funded central office folks work with Title I funded schools. However, they collaborate really tightly with our core literacy folks, with our core math folks. Because our messages to the school is, it should not matter who funds your position. This is the job, and this is the expectation, and this is what you do for teachers so teachers can help kids. But yes, same.
So how many schools are receiving Title I this year?
This year it's 44. and only one of those is a regular middle school. Otherwise, secondary schools are our alternative schools.
Did you have a follow-up?
No, it's not appropriate.
Must be really bad.
Self-regulation.
Self-regulation.
Excellent skill.
We'll ask you later.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Hartenstein, would you like to see the literacy coach job description?
No, I just wanted to know if there was any difference, the fact that it was, no. I probably seen it.
Yeah, perhaps so. Yeah.
Because my thinking is
I had an amazing one. Who's still there?
is higher.
Any other questions?
There are more children.
More funny. More children gives you more funny. If you had it at
You have a question, Ms. Gibbs?
I didn't understand why it's more per pupil.
Why the differentiated funding?
455, as the number goes up in a school, why you spend more per student? You have more students, so you'd have more per school, but I don't know.
So I think this was really the first foray from the district into something that we've talked a lot about at this table, which was how we differentiate resources based on need. And so what happened with what we were doing with Title I, there was a number of changes that took place that year. The first is that we had been funding schools at the 35% F&R threshold for 20-some years. And the district average had continued to go up, but we hadn't changed the Title I threshold. And so we were funding lots of Title I schools with lesser and lesser amounts of dollars. So we needed to do a reset. What's the district average F&R? I think we did something like 10% above that. And so that's where we came up with the threshold of 45. So that we had to do a bridge year there because we had a number of schools that fell out that were between 35 and 45. So that was step one, changing the threshold to 45. And then the second step of differentiating the resources was acknowledging that schools that have higher concentrations of high-need students have a differentiated need because they are more highly concentrated. And so that's why if there's a 65% F&R or higher in the school, there's a higher allocation than a school that's 45 to 55.
See, I understood that by school. I didn't know it was that we even increased it by per pupil and then the school. They're going to get more by the number of students, but they're also going to get more per each student.
Correct.
Okay. Well, that's...
And in many of those schools, they've used those additional funds for student support staff, a full-time social worker, an additional full-time school counselor, to try to help the whole child.
So a lot of that differentiation.
We don't know that.
A lot of the 1,100 plus schools, almost all of them, not all of them, almost all of the ESM schools except for maybe one are in that 1,100 category. So that was the other trade-off that we had that year was the local budget case to fund the elementary support model was about $4 million, $4 to $5 million. We couldn't get it through. So we changed the funding source from local requests to Title I because those expenditures were allowable in Title I. So the additional counselor or social worker that ESM schools get, the additional time for PD that ESM schools get for teachers is funded out of Title I. That's another reason it's a higher amount.
Okay, now that makes sense to me. I didn't know that.
Well, I know.
So not a question about this, but a comment. I want to thank you for this format of presentation. I find it much better than PowerPoints because it's a one-pager. You can look through it, and the text on a one-pager for me is much better than 10 PowerPoint slides. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Good for you.
What did you say?
I said education. I said uneducated, but I meant to say non-educated.
I think this communicates more effectively than PowerPoint with.
I do. I like that too. I got it.
As long as everybody has a copy of it.
Online.
Any other questions for Stella?
I'm gonna start wearing a mask at this table.
You know, I was just sitting here thinking, I was like, okay, I'm hoping that everybody's feeling the cool air and it's causing your allergies to kick in and not colds.
I know.
That's what I'm hoping, all the sneezing.
I don't have this much sneezing on a hospital.
I don't know. Maybe just talk. Leave with me. So I'm going to take that as maybe there are no more questions for the staff on Title I.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't think so.
Okay.
So, oh, I cannot. Okay, Mr. Sun. So, as you will note, we actually, it's 4:41. I know. It's very impressive.
What do we do now?
Well, it's your pleasure. We can take a break or we can go into clip.
Oh, and close it.
Yeah, it's up to us.
We have items.
We have items that we can do. We can. Okay.
You got the motion.
Madam Chair,
So can we have somebody?
I make a motion to
I'm
go into
looking for
closed
it.
session to consider confidential personnel information protected under GS 143-318.11A1, A3, and A6, and 115C-319, Bridget Poole versus Wake County Public School System, Industrial Commission File Number 15-045130, Sharon Fogg versus Wake County Public School System, Industrial Commission File 16049-274, to consult with the Board of Education attorney and preserve attorney-client privilege as provided in GS 143-318.11A3, to consider confidential student information protected under GS 115C-402 and the Family Educational and Privacy Rights Act 20 U.S.C. 1-2, and to consult with the Board of Education attorney and preserve the attorney-client privilege as provided in GS 143-318.11A3. Put that in there twice.
So can you repeat that?
Yes.
She can pass it to you to read.
Okay, yeah.
We have a motion and a second to go and close. All in favor, please vote by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, same sign. Motion carries. We will now go into closed session.